All right, for this particular video, we're going to go through and take a look at trigonometric functions. We're going to graph and create some sinusoidal curves, and a sinusoidal curve is just the shape that we get when we graph a sine or a cosine function. So we're going to go through and graph sine and cosine. I'm going to show you where they come from and how you get the values. And then we're going to determine the amplitude and the period of sine and cosine functions. And we're only going to do those two in this one particular video today. So the first thing I want to point out is that I'll annotate here, but what we know is we have the values, 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2. We know these are all the values that are in the first quadrant. And we know also that this ends, like right here is the first quadrant. And we know that as we rotate our way around, that the side opposite in the right triangle, so if I go through and I draw a right triangle here, okay, so let's say this is 45 degrees in here, then we would be right here at a value of square root of 2 over 2 on the axis. So what we're now going to do is we're going to let our x-axis be the angle in radians and how much we've rotated, and then we're going to let the graph plot where we are on the y based on how far out we move on the x-axis. And in this case, the x-axis again is how much of a rotation we've gone through. So our x-axis is basically theta, not just x. So our function that we're going to graph is y equals sine of x. All right, so that's what we're going to graph. So let me get rid of everything that I've written here and let the animation do its job. So it's going to take a second to get started, but using Desmos, there's an app that shows you how the graph comes about. So if you notice, whatever the y value is for the point, that's what it's graphing, and you can see how it's connected with the red dot up above, or the red dashed line, and then on the side it's giving you the y value. So I'll reanimate this so that we can continue to see and understand where it's coming from. So as the point rotates up, it's all we're doing is just plotting as the angle is rotated through, we're plotting where the y value is. And once it gets to the end here, I'll make this thing stop. So it's going to go all the way out to 4 pi, and I will just pause. Okay, so let's talk about some of the features here. Again, this is the equation y equals sine x, where x is the angle that we've rotated through. Okay, so now just to double check a couple things, we know that the sine function will reach its max at 1 when we're at pi over 2. So if I were to rotate this, I would be here at 1 at the angle pi over 2. So if I go to pi over 2, then I should be at my maximum, which I am. When we rotate and get to pi, well, then that's 0, because that's the y value here when I rotate through to pi. When I rotate through to get to 3 pi over 2, the y value is -1. And there I am right there. I cross again at 2 pi, and I repeat this cycle over and over again. Okay? Now, some pieces of vocabulary that we need to know. We need to know what is the amplitude. And the amplitude is basically the height of the sine function or the cosine function. So it's the height of the sinusoidal curve. That's a basic way of thinking about it. So what it is, okay, so here's where I'm at on my midline, and then how far is that distance from the midline to the max or to the min? That's the amplitude. All right, so I just used another word too. This right here is known as the midline. My amplitude in this case is also basically whatever the radius of the circle is. So if you looked, our radius that we have, because this was a unit circle, is 1. So the amplitude is just 1 unit. Then we have to deal with the period. So the period is how far do we go in order to finish an entire cycle? All right, so finish an entire cycle, go all the way around. So if you look, first off, if I just have this particular circle, go all the way around, that goes to 2 pi. So normally the period is going to be 2 pi, and it's always 2 pi for this particular function. Again, we're looking at the base or parent functions today only. So my period is going to be 2 pi. That's how long it takes to finish an entire cycle. And notice I have completed 2 entire cycles in this particular animation. Okay, so we know about the amplitude. The amplitude is the height, and it's 1 unit, and it goes from the midline to its max, or the midline to its minimum. And then period is how long until it finally gets through an entire cycle. All right, so now for the cosine function. For the cosine function, it's going to be a little different looking. Remember that the sine and cosine are cofunctions of one another. So if they are cofunctions of one another, remember, sine of 30 degrees is equal to the cosine of 60 degrees. So that's why all of these values look familiar, as we already know, but I'm just trying to throw that out there so that we can remember the different facets. So now we're going to go through and graph y equals cosine of x. So now remember, cosine is going to deal with the distance along the x-axis. So as I rotate through, here's the distance for my x is going to be there. If I'm back here, then this is the distance for my x. If I'm here in my rotation, then my distance for x is only going to be this far. So as it graphs this time, it's going to go around the circle, so it combines the different parts so that you can see again like what we did in the last one. It's going to rotate around, but this time it's going to measure this x value, and then it's going to translate it as the new y value. Because again, the inputs and outputs, all right, so I'm looking for the distance away from 0 on the x is going to be translated this way. Okay, so let me clear this, and then it's easier just to go through and watch, and then we'll talk about it after. So notice where it's starting. Okay, as it's rotating around, you're going to see that, okay, well, the cosine, when I get down here at 3 pi over 2, that's 0. When I get back here, I'm at 1. And it's just going through what is the distance away from the y-axis in the circle, and that's how we're getting our graph. Okay, so in other words, if you paid attention, you could see that it was going through and showing this line here, which is the equivalent of this dashed line as it was going through. It was moving back and forth. You could see how far away from the y-axis was then translated into the vertical values here. So we're just plotting all of these values as we rotate through. So now notice the cosine starts at 1, where the sine started at 0. So when I graph, and you can see it going through here again, as I'm graphing, it started at 1 because that was the value of the cosine function when there was no angle that we're rotating through. Okay, so now we'll let this complete its animation, and let's go ahead and write on it. So again, we have the amplitude that we need to concern ourselves with, and the amplitude is going to be the same. Again, it's just the distance here from the midline, and in this case, this is where my midline is. From the midline to the maximum, or midline to the minimum. Notice that cosine starts at 1, where the sine started at 0. Okay, and that's just because that's the value that we have when we're rotating through. The cosine function gives me this distance in a unit circle. So if I were to draw my reference triangle, this would be my cosine value here. Remember, this is my sine value. So my amplitude again is 1 unit. My midline is the line that basically, as it rotates around, it's the one right in the middle that is the divider of the basically between the maximum and the minimum. And then we have to talk about the period. So how long before this graph goes through an entire cycle. So if I'm starting here at 1, come down to 0 to -1 to 0, back to 1 again, that's one full period. So notice we've gone 2 pi. Okay. So this can be a little bit confusing in the very beginning. Hopefully the animation helped you to at least understand where it's coming from. Um, we won't be using the animation here moving forward because we're just going to go through and plot our points and get our graph ideas. So this is just to help you understand where things are coming from and to understand what an amplitude is and what a period is.